Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Consider this mystery. The most sought-after object in Western civilization may never have existed at all, yet its absence has shaped 2,000 years of human longing more profoundly than most real artifacts ever could. The Holy Grail represents the ultimate sacred mystery, a vessel that supposedly held the blood of Christ, yet it appears nowhere in the Gospels themselves. It emerged from the shadows of early Christianity, transformed through medieval romance, and became an obsession that has driven knights to madness, scholars to lifetimes of fruitless research, and even Nazi occultists to scour ancient castles. Tonight, we journey through the labyrinthine history of the Grail, from an upper room in Jerusalem to the wasteland of the Fisher King, from the pure vision of Galahad to the dark obsessions of the 20th century. In the coming hours, we will trace how a simple cup became the most powerful symbol of spiritual transformation in Western culture. We'll stand in candlelit processions where the Grail passes before wondering eyes, ride with knights through enchanted forests, where every turn might reveal either salvation or damnation, and explore how this Christian symbol absorbed older, deeper magic from Celtic cauldrons of plenty and stones that fell from heaven. The Grail is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, as present in a Welsh wooden bowl as in a golden chalice in Valencia, as real in the imagination as it could ever be in physical form. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. As the present fades to whispers, we find ourselves transported to a lamplit room in Jerusalem, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and bitter herbs, where 13 men gather for what they don't yet know will be their final meal together. The story of the Grail, if we can even speak of a beginning for something so layered with meaning, must start in that upper room during the Feast of Passover, somewhere around the year 30 AD. The Synoptic Gospels tell us that Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying this was his body. Then he took a cup, gave thanks, and passed it among them, declaring it held his blood of the new covenant, poured out for many. Yet nowhere does Matthew, Mark, or Luke describe this cup in detail. John's Gospel, so rich in symbolic language about Jesus as the vine and believers as branches, doesn't even mention the cup at the Last Supper, focusing instead on the washing of feet. This silence about the physical nature of the cup would prove to be the fertile void from which 1,000 stories would grow. Was it made of clay, common and humble like the carpenter's son who lifted it? Was it silver, borrowed from the wealthy man who owned the upper room? Was it, as later traditions would claim, carved from a single precious stone, an emerald that fell from Lucifer's crown as he plummeted from heaven? The Gospel's indifference to such details suggests the early Christians cared only about what the cup contained and meant, not what it was made of. Yet human nature abhors such vacuums of detail, and into this silence, imagination poured like wine into an empty vessel. The transformation of this Passover cup into the Holy Grail required several more elements to fall into place. The Gospel of John, though it ignores the cup at the Last Supper, provides a crucial detail that would shape the Grail legend for centuries. When the Roman soldier pierced Jesus' side with a lance to confirm his death, blood and water flowed from the wound. Medieval minds would see in this moment a profound connection. The blood that had been symbolically offered in the cup was now literally flowing from Christ's body. Someone, they reasoned, must have caught this precious blood. Someone must have preserved it. You stand in the upper room. You push aside the heavy curtain and step into the upper room as the sun sets over Jerusalem, painting the limestone walls gold and amber. The scent hits you first, that distinctive mixture of roasted lamb still steaming on the platter, the sharp tang of bitter herbs, the yeasty warmth of freshly broken bread. Your feet find their place among the cushions scattered on the floor, the fabric rough against your skin, still warm from the day's heat, radiating through the stones beneath. The oil lamps flicker in their niches, casting dancing shadows that make the faces around you seem to shift between recognition and mystery. You hear the rustle of robes as bodies adjust their positions, the quiet clink of pottery as someone reaches for bread, the low murmur of conversation in Aramaic, the words flowing with that distinctive Galilean accent. There's tension in the air, thick as the smoke from the lamps, though you cannot name its source. Perhaps it's in the way some of the men keep glancing toward the door, or how their hands rest too close to where they might keep a blade. The cup sits before you on the low table, unremarkable in every way that matters to history. It's ceramic, you think, though the lamplight makes it difficult to be certain. Local craftsmanship, with a slightly irregular rim that speaks of human hands at the potter's wheel rather than perfect symmetry. You've drunk from a dozen cups like this one. Yet when it's lifted, when those familiar words are spoken in that unfamiliar tone, something shifts in the room's atmosphere. The ordinary cup contains wine, yes, but the speaker is saying it contains more than wine, contains blood, contains covenant, contains remembrance and presence and mystery all at once. You taste the wine when the cup comes to you, harsh and sweet simultaneously, coating your tongue with its complexity. Your fingers feel the cup's weight, lighter than you expected, as if it might float away if you loosened your grip. You pass it to the person beside you, and for a moment, your hands touch theirs, warm and real, and trembling slightly. Outside, you hear the city preparing for Passover night, the distant bleating of lambs, the calls of merchants closing their stalls, children's voices raised in excitement or complaint. But inside this room, time seems to pause, holding its breath, as if the universe itself recognizes that something fundamental is changing, though none of you quite understand what, or how, or why. The cup continues its journey around the room, hand to hand, mouth to mouth, each person taking their portion of this strange new covenant. You watch it move through the lamplight and shadow, sometimes seeming to glow with its own inner light, sometimes disappearing entirely into darkness before emerging again. Already you're trying to memorize every detail, though you're not sure why it feels so important. The way the wine clings to the cup's inner surface, the small chip on its base that you noticed when you held it, the expression on each face as they drink, confused and trusting and fearful all at once. Blood and water, the first transformation. Joseph of Arimathea emerges from the Gospels as a figure of fascinating contradictions, a wealthy member of the very Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus, yet also a secret disciple who risked everything to ensure proper burial for the crucified prophet. All four Gospels mention him, though with varying details that would later prove fertile ground for legend-making. Mark calls him a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God. Matthew identifies him explicitly as a rich man who had become a disciple. Luke adds that he had not consented to the council's decision and action. John provides the detail that would resonate through centuries. Joseph was a secret disciple because he feared the Jewish leaders. The Gospel accounts agree on the essential facts of what happened after the crucifixion. Joseph went boldly to Pilate, requesting the body of Jesus. The Roman governor, surprised that death had come so quickly, verified the fact with the centurion before granting Joseph's request. Joseph purchased fine linen, took down the body, wrapped it carefully in the cloth with spices provided by Nicodemus, and laid it in his own new tomb, hewn from rock, where no one had ever been laid. The stone was rolled across the entrance as the Sabbath approached, and the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee watched to see where he was laid. But the medieval imagination could not let Joseph's story end there, at the entrance to a sealed tomb. If Joseph had shown such devotion, surely he would have been present at the crucifixion itself. If he had been present, surely he would have noticed when the soldier's spear pierced Christ's side and blood and water flowed forth. And if he had noticed, surely this man of means and devotion would have thought to preserve that precious blood, the vessel he used? Perhaps the very cup from the Last Supper, which someone must have kept, which Providence must have ensured, would be present at this crucial moment. The apocryphal Gospel of Nicodemus, dating from around the 4th century but widely read in the Middle Ages, provides the bridge between the biblical Joseph and the Grail keeper. In this text, Joseph is imprisoned by the Jewish authorities after the burial, locked in a windowless cell without food or water. But on the night of the resurrection, the risen Christ appears to him in a blaze of light, lifts him up, and shows him the empty tomb as proof of his victory over death. Christ then returns Joseph to his home, commanding him to remain there for 40 days. This miraculous preservation, this intimate connection with the risen Lord, marked Joseph as someone special, someone chosen, someone who might indeed have been entrusted with the most sacred of relics. The next transformation of Joseph's story would wait until the late 12th century, when Robert de Boron composed his Joseph d'Arimathie. Now Joseph becomes not just the keeper of the Grail, but its evangelist, carrying it westward from Jerusalem. In prison, Christ appears to him again, bringing the cup from the Last Supper and teaching him the secret words of consecration, the proper ritual for the Grail Mass. Joseph's imprisonment extends to 42 years, during which he is sustained solely by the power of the Grail, needing neither food nor water. When finally released after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Joseph gathers a company of believers and begins the long journey west. The legend continues to grow, adding details with each retelling. Joseph's companionship includes his sister Enigeus and her husband Bron, who had become the rich fisher king. When the company faces starvation, Joseph prays before the Grail, and Bron catches a miraculous fish that feeds all the worthy but reveals the sinners among them when they cannot eat. The Grail becomes a test of spiritual purity, a divider between the worthy and unworthy, the saved and the damned. It creates its own sacred lineage, the Grail keepers, who must maintain perfect purity or lose their power to approach the holy vessel. The blood caught in the cup transforms it from a memorial object into something more profound, a container for the actual essence of divine sacrifice. Medieval theology struggled with this concept, dancing between metaphor and literalism. Did the Grail contain Christ's actual blood, preserved miraculously through centuries, or did it become sanctified by contact, charged with holy power like the relics of saints? The ambiguity proved to be the legend's strength, allowing each generation to pour their own understanding into this vessel that could never quite be filled or emptied. Glastonbury's Green Veil. The mists rise from the Somerset levels, as they have for millennia, wreathing Glastonbury Tor in veils of grey and silver that make it seem to float above the earth, like an island between worlds. Here, in this green veil of apple orchards and sacred wells, Joseph of Arimathea supposedly completed his great journey, planting his staff in Weary All Hill, where it burst into bloom as the holy thorn. The monks of Glastonbury Abbey, master storytellers and keepers of profitable legends, claim that Joseph arrived here with 11 companions in the year 63 AD, carrying not just the Grail, but also 2 cruets containing the blood and sweat of Christ. The landscape itself seems to remember ancient sanctity. The chalice well runs red with iron oxide, which medieval pilgrims saw as the eternal flowing of Christ's blood through the very earth of Britain. The water tastes of metal and minerals, sharp on the tongue, undeniably real, yet somehow otherworldly. Pilgrims still come to drink from it, to fill small bottles to carry home, to sit in the gardens where yew trees, older than the legend itself, stand witness to centuries of seeking. The well's cover bears the Vesica Piscis, 2 interlocking circles that create the fish symbol of early Christianity, but also echo older sacred geometry, the intersection of heaven and earth, spirit and matter. The abbey claimed to possess Joseph's tomb, though it was conveniently lost in the Great Fire of 1184 that also destroyed what the monks said was the oldest Christian church in Britain, built by Joseph himself from wattle and daub. When the monks discovered what they proclaimed to be Arthur and Guinevere's graves in 1191, perfectly timed to boost pilgrim revenues for their rebuilding campaign, they reinforced the connection between Glastonbury, Arthur, and the Grail that would shape British mythology forever. The landscape absorbed the legend until every spring and stone seemed to whisper of hidden mysteries and ancient arrivals. Even now, walking through the abbey ruins, where Gothic arches frame empty sky, you can feel how the story rooted itself in this particular earth. The great church that once stood here stretched longer than a football field, its walls decorated with images of Joseph's arrival, the flowering staff, the sacred vessels. Though Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries left only broken walls and scattered stones, the Grail presence lingers in the very air, in the way twilight falls across the Tor, in the taste of the spring water, in the apple trees that bloom white as thorns each spring. The Fisher King's wound. In a castle that stands sometimes in Wales, sometimes in France, sometimes in that unmappable realm between waking and sleeping, the Fisher King lies on his jewelled bed, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. His wound throbs with each heartbeat, a spear thrust through his thighs or groin, the exact location shifting, with each telling, as if the pain itself refuses to be pinned down. Some say he sinned through lust, others that he was wounded, defending the Grail from unworthy seekers. The wound never heals, but never quite kills him, keeping him suspended in an eternal present of suffering that mirrors the land around his castle. He was young once, this keeper of the Grail, strong and proud, as all the Grail lineage must be. He rode out in armour that caught the sun like water, his lance steady, his purpose clear. But something went wrong at the moment of his greatest triumph or deepest failing. The spear that pierced him carried more than mortal injury. It severed him from wholeness, from the natural cycle of healing and death, binding him to an existence that serves only as a question. Whom does the Grail serve? The answer seems simple, but generations of knights will fail to ask it, focused on their own glory rather than the king's suffering. By day, when his pain ebbs enough to allow movement, servants carry him to the river, where he fishes with a silver hook and silken line. The fish rise to his bait as if commanded, but he throws most back, keeping only enough to feed the strange household that maintains its existence around his wounded presence. The castle's servants move through their duties like sleepwalkers, beautiful and terrible, preparing each night for the Grail procession that proceeds whether any guest arrives to witness it or not. They've forgotten their own names, remembering only their functions in the eternal ritual. The land around his castle reflects his wound in dying fields and poisoned streams. Trees bear no fruit, though their branches strain toward flowering. Wells that once ran clear now give only brackish water, or run completely dry. The very air seems to ache with sympathetic pain, heavy and still, as if the wind itself has forgotten how to blow. This is the wasteland, held in stasis by the Fisher King's unhealing wound, waiting for the pure knight who will ask the right question, speak the words that will allow the king to die and the land to live again. But most who come are too awed by the Grail's presence to think of compassion, too focused on their own quest to see the suffering that maintains their sacred object. When evening falls and the Fisher King is carried back to his hall, he lies on his bed of pain while the Grail procession begins. First comes the white-clad maiden bearing the bleeding lance, then another with the paten, and finally she who carries the Grail itself, veiled in white samite, glowing with its own light that makes the 1,000 candles in the hall seem dim as stars at sunrise. The Grail passes before him, so close he could touch it if he dared, yet it brings him no healing, only the reminder of what grace exists forever, just beyond his reach. When Chrétien dreamed, Chrétien de Troyes set down his quill sometime around 1190, leaving unfinished the work that would haunt European imagination for the next 8 centuries. He was court poet to Marie de Champagne, daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, writing for an audience that craved stories of love and adventure, of knights who served ladies with religious devotion and sought glory through impossible quests. His Percival, or the story of the Grail, began conventionally enough with a young Welsh boy raised in ignorance of knighthood by a mother who had lost her husband and other sons to chivalric violence. But when Chrétien introduced the Grail procession, he created something unprecedented in Arthurian literature, something that his own death would leave tantalizingly incomplete. Chrétien never called it the Holy Grail, simply un Graal, a grail, as if his audience should already know what such an object was. The word itself derives from the Latin graedalis, meaning a broad, shallow dish or serving vessel, the kind that might hold a large fish for a feast. But in Chrétien's telling, this Graal holds a single mass wafer, the consecrated host that miraculously sustains the Fisher King's ancient father, who has lived for 12 years in an inner chamber on no other food. Already the transformation has begun, from serving dish to sacred vessel, from container of earthly food to source of spiritual sustenance. The poet's description of the Grail procession reads like a fever dream, luminous with details that refuse to resolve into simple allegory. A youth carries a white lance, from which a drop of blood runs down to his hand. 2 more youths carry candelabra of finest gold, each holding at least 10 candles. Then enters a maiden, beautiful and elegantly dressed, carrying between her 2 hands a Graal of pure refined gold, adorned with the finest precious stones in earthly existence or in the seas. When she enters carrying the Graal, such brilliant light appears that the candles lose their brightness like stars when the sun or moon rises. What did Chrétien mean by this procession? Was he drawing on some Celtic tradition of magical vessels, the cauldrons of plenty that appear in Welsh and Irish mythology? Was he encoding Christian mysteries in chivalric romance, creating a Eucharistic vision that his aristocratic audience would recognize as profoundly sacred? Or was he doing something more radical, fusing pagan and Christian elements into a new synthesis that spoke to the deep psychological needs of his culture? His death left these questions unanswered, the poem breaking off mid-sentence as Percival's adventures continue, the Grail's full meaning forever suspended in literary amber. The incompleteness proved to be Chrétien's greatest gift to posterity. 4 different poets attempted continuations within the next 50 years, each pulling the story in different directions, adding 10,000, 20,000, even 60,000 lines to Chrétien's original 9,000. They tried to explain what Chrétien left mysterious, to moralize what he left ambiguous, to complete what perhaps was never meant to be completed. But none could recapture the haunting quality of that first procession, the sense of witnessing something whose meaning hovers forever just beyond comprehension, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to be spoken. Percival's first vision. The young knight enters the hall with mud still on his boots, and wonder expanding in his chest like morning light breaking through forest canopy. Percival has been knighted only days before, his armour still unmarked by battle, his understanding of chivalry limited to the external forms he observed in that brief encounter with knights in his mother's forest. He knows nothing of the subtle currents that flow beneath courtly surfaces, the languages of gesture and implication that govern noble behaviour. His very ignorance makes him the perfect witness, approaching the miraculous with neither expectation nor prejudice, seeing with the clear eyes of inexperience what others might dismiss through too much knowledge. The Fisher King receives him with inexplicable warmth. This boy who arrived unannounced at a castle that appears on no maps, that seems to exist in a fold of reality, accessible only to those meant to find it. The king apologizes that his wound prevents him from rising to greet his guest properly, but he gives Percival a sword of finest steel, its pommel carved from a single ruby, its blade inscribed with words in a language that predates human speech. The gift seems disproportionate to the occasion, as if the king recognizes something in this raw youth that Percival doesn't recognize in himself. The hall fills with a light that doesn't come from the 100 candles burning in their sconces or the great fire roaring in the hearth. Percival watches. As the procession begins, each element more wondrous than the last, building towards something his mind can barely grasp. The bleeding lance passes so close he could touch it, could ask why it bleeds, whom it has wounded, what battle it remembers. But his mother's final warning echoes in his mind. Don't ask too many questions. Don't make yourself tiresome with excessive curiosity. The training in courtesy that he received from Gornament reinforces this maternal advice. A good knight doesn't pry into mysteries that aren't freely offered. The Grail itself moves through the hall with impossible slowness, as if time itself yields to its passage. Percival sees how it illuminates not just the space, but the people within it, revealing them as they truly are beneath their courtly facades. In its light, the Fisher King's wound becomes visible through his rich robes, a darkness that pulses with each heartbeat. The servants show themselves as beautiful beyond mortal beauty, yet hollow, as if they're only memories of people rather than people themselves. And Percival, when the light touches him, feels himself seen completely, every thought and failing exposed, yet somehow not judged, only acknowledged. 5 times during the feast the Grail passes through the hall, each time disappearing into an inner chamber, where someone unseen waits to be served. 5 times Percival prepares to ask his question, whom does the Grail serve? And 5 times courtesy strangles curiosity in his throat. He decides to wait until morning, to ask a servant privately, rather than interrupt the sacred ritual with his ignorance. But when morning comes, the castle stands empty, his horse saddled, and waiting in a courtyard where no footprints mark the frost. As he rides across the drawbridge, it rises behind him with such violence that it nearly catches his horse's hooves, and when he looks back, castle and bridge have vanished as if they never existed. Later, in the court of King Arthur, he will learn the cost of his silence. A hideous maiden will arrive to curse him publicly for his failure. The Fisher King could have been healed, the wasteland restored to fertility, if only Percival had asked the question. His misguided courtesy, his fear of seeming foolish, has prolonged suffering that could have ended with a few simple words. The Grail offered itself to him, presented its mystery openly, needed only his human curiosity to complete its work. But he chose politeness over compassion, form over substance, and now he must spend years seeking what was freely given, trying to find again the castle that only appears to those who don't seek it. Between the lines, what medieval minds knew is less than #0. 5# is greater than. To understand what Chrétien's first audience heard in his Grail story, we must immerse ourselves in the peculiar psychology of the late 12th century, a time when the physical and spiritual worlds interpenetrated in ways that seem foreign to modern consciousness. This was an age that believed utterly in the power of relics, where a splinter of the true cross or a saint's knucklebone could cure disease, ensure victory in battle, or guarantee favourable weather for harvest. Every cathedral and monastery competed to acquire the most powerful relics, building elaborate reliquaries to house them, creating pilgrimage routes that moved wealth and people across continents. The body parts of holy men and women were divided and distributed like spiritual currency, each fragment carrying the full power of the saint's heavenly presence. The Eucharist itself was undergoing profound theological development during Chrétien's lifetime. The doctrine of transubstantiation, though not formally defined until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, was already being elaborated by theologians like Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas. The bread and wine didn't merely symbolize Christ's body and blood. They became, through the mystery of consecration, the actual substance of divinity while maintaining the accidents, the appearance of ordinary food. This philosophical framework, borrowed from Aristotle but transformed by Christian theology, meant that medieval Christians lived in a world where material objects could be literally more than they appeared, where the boundary between matter and spirit was permeable, negotiable, subject to miraculous transformation. The mass wafer that sustains the Fisher King's father in Chrétien's story would have resonated with contemporary accounts of saints and mystics who lived for years on nothing but the consecrated host. These stories weren't metaphorical to medieval audiences, but literal testimonies to the Eucharist's power to transcend natural law. Christina the Astonishing, Catherine of Siena, and numerous other holy women were said to have survived on the host alone, their bodies sustained by divine nourishment that surpassed earthly food. The Grail, holding its single wafer, concentrated this Eucharistic mystery into a portable miracle, a travelling tabernacle that brought divine presence wherever it went. The aristocratic culture that consumed these romances lived according to complex codes that governed every aspect of behaviour, from how to enter a room to how to die with honour. The concept of courtesy that silences Percival wasn't simply about good manners, but about maintaining the elaborate social fabric that distinguished the nobility from common folk. To ask too many questions showed lack of breeding, suggested that one hadn't been properly educated in the unspoken rules that every noble child absorbed from birth. Chrétien's audience would have felt Percival's dilemma viscerally, torn between the impulse to understand and the training that marked him as worthy of understanding. Yet beneath this rigid social structure lay older currents that Christianity had never fully absorbed or suppressed. The Celtic traditions of Wales, Brittany, and Ireland spoke of otherworld vessels that provided unlimited food, cauldrons that could restore the dead to life, cups that would break if 3 lies were spoken over them. The sovereignty goddess of Irish tradition offered a cup to the rightful king, and only his lips could drink from it. These stories, transmitted through travelling storytellers and the cultural mixing of the Norman conquest, provided a mythological substrate that Christian imagery could overlay, but not entirely replace. The number symbolism in the Grail procession would have carried meaning that modern readers might miss. 3 youths bearing objects, echoing the Trinity. 5 passages of the Grail through the hall, corresponding to the 5 wounds of Christ. 12 years the Fisher King's father has lived on the host alone, paralleling the 12 apostles, the 12 tribes of Israel, the completion of cosmic order. Medieval minds thought in these correspondences, seeing patterns that connected earthly events to heavenly archetypes, numerical relationships that revealed divine intention in apparent randomness. The very idea of the quest, so central to Grail literature, reflected the spiritual psychology of the age. The physical journey to Jerusalem or Compostela externalized an internal pilgrimage toward God. Knights who took crusading vows understood themselves to be pursuing spiritual purification through martial action. The quest for the Grail combined pilgrimage, crusade, and mystical, seeking into a single narrative structure that spoke to all levels of medieval society, from the warrior aristocracy to the contemplative religious, to the common people who dreamed of transcendence but remained bound to the soil. The candlelight processional. Watch how the light moves first, before the bearers become visible, a golden wave that flows along the stone walls, like honey poured from an infinite vessel. The shadows retreat into corners and crevices, gathering there like dark prayers, trembling at the approach of something they recognize but cannot name. 100 candles burn in the hall, but their light seems suddenly timid, drawing back like servants making way for their master. The air itself grows luminous, not bright, but deep, as if you could reach into it and pull out handfuls of liquid gold. The youth who carries the lance walks with measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, his face smooth as alabaster in the strange light. The lance point gleams white as fresh bone, and from it rolls a single drop of blood that never falls, always travelling down the shaft, reaching his hand, disappearing, then beginning again at the point. The blood looks fresh, as if the wound it remembers was made moments ago, yet ancient, as if it has been bleeding since the foundation of the world. His eyes remain fixed on something beyond the hall's far wall, seeing through stone and time to a hilltop where 3 crosses stand against a darkening sky. Behind him come 2 more youths, with candelabra of worked gold, each branch a tree of light, each flame a small sun that burns without consuming. The candelabra seem to float rather than be carried, their bearers merely guiding them through space rather than supporting their weight. The flames don't flicker, despite the movement, burning straight and still, as if protected by invisible glass. Yet you can feel their heat as they pass, a warmth that penetrates not just skin but soul, finding cold places you didn't know existed and filling them with summer. Robert de Boron's sacred history. Robert de Boron transformed the Grail from Chrétien's mysterious un Grail into the Holy Grail proper, fixing its identity forever as the cup of the Last Supper and the vessel of Christ's blood. Writing his Joseph d'Arimathie sometime between 1190 and 1210, Robert was possibly a clerk in the service of Gautier de Montbéliard, who took the cross for the Fourth Crusade. His patron's departure for the Holy Land may have inspired Robert to create his own literary crusade, a textual recovery of Christianity's most sacred vessel that would prove more enduring than any military conquest of Jerusalem. Robert's innovation was to provide the Grail with a genealogy, a chain of custody that linked the apostolic age to Arthurian Britain through an unbroken succession of keepers. His Joseph doesn't simply acquire the cup by chance, but receives it directly from Christ himself during a mystical vision in prison. The risen Lord appears, carrying the vessel, teaches Joseph the secret words of the Grail Mass, words that only the Grail keeper can know and must pass to his successor at the moment of death. This creates an alternative apostolic succession, parallel to, but separate from the institutional church, a bloodline of secret knowledge preserved outside orthodox channels. The theology Robert embeds in his romance reflects the religious anxieties of his age when the Cathar heresy challenged Catholic orthodoxy and the failure of crusades raised questions about divine favour. The Grail becomes a symbol of direct, divine presence that doesn't require clerical mediation, yet it also demands absolute purity from those who would approach it. When Joseph's company faces starvation during their westward journey, the Grail reveals the unworthiness of certain followers who cannot eat the miraculous fish. The vessel judges without mercy, dividing the pure from the impure, the elect from the damned. Robert describes the Grail table that Joseph establishes in imitation of the Last Supper, with one seat left empty to represent Judas's place. This siege perilous will destroy anyone who sits in it, except the chosen knight who will achieve the Grail quest. The symbolism layers Christian numerology onto Arthurian romance. 12 seats for the apostles, 1 empty for the traitor, all waiting for redemption through a future perfect knight. The round table itself becomes a Grail table once removed. Arthur's secular imitation of Joseph's sacred institution, chivalry attempting to embody holiness through martial virtue. The text establishes Bronn, Joseph's brother-in-law, as the rich fisher, though Robert doesn't explain the wound that will define the Fisher King in later stories. Bronn receives the Grail from Joseph and carries it further west to the Vales of Averon, which Robert's audience would recognise as Avalon, Arthur's mystical resting place. The geography becomes explicitly British, linking the Grail to the emerging national mythology that would make Arthur and his knights the defining heroes of English and French literature. Robert promises to tell how the Grail passes from Bronn to Percival, his grandson, though this continuation either was never written or hasn't survived. What Robert achieved was a Christianization that paradoxically made the Grail more mysterious rather than less. By identifying it explicitly as Christ's cup, he raised questions that purely fictional objects wouldn't provoke. If this cup existed, where was it now? Could it still be found? Did its keepers still maintain their secret succession somewhere in Britain or beyond? The romance became a kind of alternative scripture, a testament to divine presence that existed outside the control of Rome or Canterbury, available to anyone pure enough to seek it. The Round Table's highest purpose. The Feast of Pentecost arrives at Camelot, with white flowers blooming in the castle gardens and a sense of expectation hanging in the air like incense before High Mass. Arthur's knights gather as they have for years, taking their appointed seats at the Round Table, that perfect circle that allows no head or foot, no higher or lower place, only the equality of shared purpose and mutual honour. But this Pentecost will shatter their comfortable fellowship, transform their earthly chivalry into spiritual seeking, and send them scattered to the world's edges, in pursuit of something most will never find. The Siege Perilous has remained empty since the table's founding, its high back carved with letters that shift and change when viewed directly, resolving only in peripheral vision to read that this seat will destroy any who dare occupy it, save the chosen knight who will achieve the adventures of the Holy Grail. Some say Merlin carved these words before his imprisonment in crystal, others that they appeared spontaneously when the first unworthy knight attempted to sit there and was swallowed by the earth. The empty seat serves as a constant reminder of incompleteness, of a perfection not yet achieved, of a promise waiting for fulfillment. This morning, as Arthur and his knights prepare to sit for their feast, an ancient hermit enters the hall, leading a young knight in red armour. Galahad, son of Lancelot, conceived through enchantment, when Elaine of Corbenic deceived Lancelot into believing she was Guinevere. The sin of his conception has been transformed through his upbringing by holy sisters into a purity that surpasses nature. He bears no shield, carries a sword still sheathed in its scabbard, and walks with the certainty of one who has never doubted his purpose. The hermit leads him directly to the Siege Perilous, where new words have appeared overnight. This is the seat of Galahad. When Galahad sits, the earth doesn't swallow him. Instead, a sound like distant thunder rolls through the hall, though the sky outside remains cloudless. The knights look at each other with wonder and perhaps the first stirrings of fear, recognizing that their world has fundamentally changed. Arthur tests the young knight by having him attempt to draw a sword from a stone that has appeared floating in the river, a sword that bears the inscription that only the best knight in the world can draw it. Galahad withdraws it as easily as pulling a flower from soft earth, confirming what the Siege Perilous has already declared. The promised night has come, and the final adventures are about to begin. That evening, as the knights sit again for their feast, thunder crashes directly overhead, and the hall fills with brilliant light. Every door and window slams shut, though no wind blows, and the knights find themselves unable to speak, as if their tongues have been bound by invisible threads. The Holy Grail enters, though none can see who bears it, covered in white samite, so that its exact form remains hidden. It moves through the hall with deliberate slowness, and as it passes each knight, his plate fills with whatever food he most desires, his cup with the wine he loves best. The hall fills with fragrances that shouldn't exist together: roses and myrrh, fresh bread and spring rain, childhood memories made olfactory and present. When the Grail withdraws and speech returns, Gawain is the first to stand and make his vow. He will seek the Grail for a year and a day, he declares, will not return until he has seen it more openly than this veiled apparition. One by one the others rise to make the same promise, caught in the competitive honour that has always driven them, unable to let another claim glory they might share. Only Arthur remains seated, his face grey with foreknowledge of loss. He knows that the Round Table will never again be complete, that many who ride out tomorrow will not return, that the earthly kingdom he built with such labour is about to dissolve in pursuit of heavenly visions. The king speaks with the weight of prophecy in his voice, telling his knights that this quest will strip away everything they thought they knew about knighthood. Prowess in battle will mean nothing. Noble birth will provide no advantage. Even courtesy and service, the virtues they've cultivated so carefully, will prove insufficient. The Grail demands something else entirely, something most of them don't possess and cannot acquire through effort or training. It requires spiritual purity, not the social performance of virtue, but its actual presence in the soul's deepest chambers. It requires the ability to see past surfaces to essences, to recognize the divine when it presents itself in humble forms. 150 knights ride out from Camelot the next morning, the flower of Arthur's court, the greatest gathering of chivalry the world has ever seen. They separate at the forest's edge, each entering at the point that seems darkest and most pathless to them. For to follow another's track would be shameful. The forest swallows them like a great green mouth, and most will wander for months or years, finding only empty chapels, hostile hermits, and visions that torment rather than illuminate. The Round Table's highest purpose has revealed itself to be its own dissolution, its earthly perfection shattered in pursuit of heavenly completion that only one or three, depending on the telling, will achieve. You ride through wastelands. You feel the leather reins cutting into your palms, already blistered from weeks of riding, as your destrier picks its way through a landscape that seems diseased. The ground beneath his hooves cracks like old parchment, sending up small clouds of grey dust that tastes of ash and abandonment when it settles on your lips. Your armour, which gleamed like captured moonlight when you left Camelot, now bears the patina of hard travel, streaked with rust, where rain has found its way through joints and seams. The weight of it presses down on your shoulders, a constant reminder of the earthly knighthood you carry into this spiritual wasteland. The sun overhead burns white and pitiless, offering light without warmth, illumination without comfort. You passed the last living tree 3 days ago, a twisted oak whose few remaining leaves rattled like bones in a wind you couldn't feel. Since then, there has been only this endless expanse of dying earth, punctuated by the ruins of what might once have been villages or hermitages, now just scattered stones that form patterns your eye wants to read as meaningful, but which dissolve into randomness when examined closely. Your horse stumbles, recovers, continues with the mechanical persistence of an animal pushed beyond exhaustion into a state that transcends mere tiredness. You dismount to check his hooves, finding them cracked and bleeding, despite the careful shoeing done by Camelot's finest farrier. There's no water to clean the wounds, hasn't been since that brackish pool yesterday that your horse refused to drink from, backing away with rolling eyes and flaring nostrils, as if he sensed some poison your duller senses couldn't detect. The hunger has evolved past the sharp pains of the first week into something else, a hollow sensation that seems to expand from your belly to fill your entire body with emptiness. You've learned to chew leather, to give your mouth something to do, to silence the part of your mind that remembers feast tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and fresh bread. Sometimes you dream you're eating, wake to find yourself chewing air, your jaw aching from the repetitive motion. The Grail promised to fill each knight's plate with his most desired food. But out here in the wasteland, desire itself begins to feel like a foreign language you once spoke but can no longer remember. A structure appears on the horizon, wavering in the heat haze, like something seen underwater. As you approach, it resolves into a chapel, its stone walls still standing, though the roof has long since collapsed. Inside, an altar remains intact, covered with a white cloth that somehow remains pristine despite the ruin around it. On the altar sits a golden candlestick, holding a single candle that burns without consuming itself, its flame perfectly still, despite the wind that whistles through the broken walls. You kneel before it, your armour scraping against stone, and try to pray. But the words that once came so easily now stick in your throat like thorns. Night falls with the suddenness of a door slamming shut, and with it comes a cold that seems to rise from the earth itself, seeping through your armour to wrap around your bones. You build a fire from wood that shouldn't exist in this dead place, but which appears when you need it. Dry branches that burn with coloured flames, blue and green and purple, releasing smoke that smells of incense and decay. In the fire's light, shadows dance on the chapel walls, forming shapes that might be angels or demons, or simply the projections of a mind worn thin by solitude and seeking. Galahad, the pure. Galahad rides through the same wasteland, but sees it differently, as if he wears special glass over his eyes that reveals the true nature hidden beneath corrupt appearances. Where others find only death and desolation, he perceives potential, dormancy rather than destruction, soil waiting for the right word to wake it into fertility. His red armor never dulls, never rusts, as if it exists partially outside the ordinary flow of time and decay. Birds that haven't been seen in the wasteland for years appear when he passes, circling overhead like a living halo, their songs piercing the oppressive silence that weighs on other travellers. He was raised on an island of women, the sisters of the Grail castle, who taught him letters and prayers, but never the rough games boys play to prepare for knighthood. Yet when they brought him weapons at the age of 15, he handled them as if remembering skills learned in another lifetime, his body knowing the perfect balance of a sword, the exact angle to couch a lance. He has never known woman or wine, never spoken a lie even to spare another's feelings, never felt the savage joy that other knights experience in battle. He fights when necessary, but takes no pleasure in it, viewing combat as a sad necessity in a fallen world, rather than the glorious expression of masculine virtue. The Grail reveals itself to him partially at unexpected moments, appearing in the flame of a hermit's candle, reflected in a pool of water that shouldn't exist in the wasteland, carried by a child who vanishes when approached directly. These visions don't drive him to frenzy as they do other knights, but seem to calm him further, each partial revelation adding to a certainty that needs no external confirmation. He knows he will achieve the Grail not through pride, but through a predestination that feels less like privilege than burden, a role he must play in a story larger than his own desires or even his own salvation. When he encounters other knights on the quest, they often don't recognize him, despite his distinctive red armor, as if something about his presence resists ordinary perception. Those who do see him clearly report a disturbing quality to his perfection, an uncanniness that makes them uncomfortable in ways they cannot articulate. Lancelot, meeting his son at a crossroads, sees in Galahad everything he himself might have been without the stain of his love for Guinevere, and the recognition drives him to his knees with a grief that feels like dying. Galahad helps his father rise, but offers no comfort beyond his presence, no absolution beyond his existence, as proof that purity remains possible, even in a corrupted world. The Templar connection. The Knights Templar entered the Grail legend through a side door, bringing with them the smell of actual crusade, the weight of real treasure, and the shadow of heresy that would eventually consume them. When Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote his Percival in the early 13th century, he transformed Chrétien's unfinished tale into something stranger and more complex, claiming to have the true story from a Provençal source named Chiot, who learned it from a heathen astronomer in Toledo named Phlegetanis, who read the Grail's secret written in the stars. Whether Chiot existed or was Wolfram's invention remains debated, but the Templar connection he introduced would prove more durable than any single source. In Wolfram's telling, the Grail Knights are explicitly called Templisen, Templars, and they guard not a cup but a stone, lapsit exilis, perhaps meaning stone from heaven, or stone of exile. This stone fell from Lucifer's crown during the war in heaven, remained neutral in the conflict between God and Satan, and now provides unlimited food and prevents anyone who sees it from dying for a week afterward. Every Good Friday, a dove descends from heaven to place a white wafer on the stone, renewing its power for another year. The symbolism layers Christian Eucharistic theology onto Islamic ideas about the black stone of Mecca and Jewish traditions of manna from heaven, creating a syncretic vision that reflects the complex cultural exchanges of the Crusades. The historical Templars, founded in 1119 to protect pilgrims to Jerusalem, had by Wolfram's time become the wealthiest and most powerful military order in Christendom. They invented international banking, built a network of fortresses from Scotland to the Holy Land, and answered only to the Pope, exempt from local secular and religious authority. Their white mantles marked with red crosses became symbols of Christian militancy, but rumours persistently suggested they had absorbed Eastern mysteries during their decades in Outremer, that their true beliefs diverged radically from Orthodox Christianity. The Templars' connection to the Grail gained retrospective significance after their destruction in 1307, when Philip the Fair of France, deeply in debt to the order, orchestrated their arrest on charges of heresy, sodomy, and idol worship. Under torture, some knights confessed to worshipping a severed head called Baphomet, spitting on the cross, and conducting secret rituals that parodied the Mass. Modern historians generally dismiss these confessions as forced fabrications, but the legend persisted that the Templars had discovered something in Jerusalem, perhaps in the tunnels beneath Solomon's temple, where they were first quartered, that gave them power beyond military might and wealth beyond mere gold. Some Grail researchers have suggested the Templars found the actual cup of the Last Supper, hidden in Jerusalem, since the city's destruction in 70 AD. Others propose they discovered documentation about Jesus that challenged Orthodox Christianity, perhaps proving he survived the crucifixion or married Mary Magdalene. The Grail as bloodline rather than object, the sang real or royal blood, enters the legend here, suggesting that what the Templars guarded was not a cup, but a genealogy, the descendants of Christ himself. These theories, however speculative, reflect the persistent sense that the Templars knew something, possessed something, that threatened the established order enough to require their complete destruction. The order's dissolution scattered the survivors across Europe, with some finding refuge in Scotland, others in Portugal where they reconstituted as the Order of Christ, and still others simply disappearing into civilian life. But the legend suggests that somewhere a remnant preserved their true purpose, maintaining their guardianship of the Grail in secret, waiting for the right moment to reveal what they had protected through centuries of hiding. Every mysterious inscription, every unexplained symbol in medieval churches, every geometric pattern in Gothic architecture becomes potential evidence of Templar influence, signs left for those who know how to read them. The Grail Castle in Wolfram's version, Munselwesche, the Mount of Salvation, resembles a Templar commandery more than Arthur's secular Camelot. Its knights take vows of chastity, unless commanded by the Grail itself to marry and produce heirs. They venture into the world on secret missions, helping the worthy and punishing the wicked, but always return to their hidden fortress where the Grail sustains them. This vision of a secret order of perfect knights, guardians of divine mystery, answerable to no earthly authority, captures something essential about both the Templar reality and the Grail ideal, the dream of a spiritual knighthood that transcends the compromises and corruptions of temporal power. Wolfram's Stone from Heaven. The transformation of the Grail from cup to stone represents one of the most radical reimaginings in the legend's evolution, yet Wolfram von Eschenbach presents his version with such conviction that it creates its own tradition, parallel to but never quite reconciling with the mainstream Grail romances. His Lapsit Exilis defies every expectation established by Chrétien and Robert de Boron, yet somehow maintains the essential mystery that makes the Grail compelling. The stone cannot be lifted by any earthly power, yet it moves from place to place according to its own will. It appears small enough to carry, yet contains infinite space within itself, a paradox that medieval minds, trained on theological mysteries like the Trinity, could accept more readily than modern rationalism allows. Wolfram describes the stone's power with precision that suggests either remarkable imagination or access to genuine esoteric traditions. Those who behold it cannot die for a week afterward, no matter their wounds or illness. It prevents aging, maintaining its guardians at whatever age they were when they first saw it, though they can choose to age naturally if they leave its presence. Every Good Friday, when the dove descends with the host, names appear on the stone's surface, calling children to join the Grail community. These chosen ones are taken from their families, raised in the Grail castle, trained in arms and letters, prepared for lives of secret service to divine will. The stone's celestial origin links it to numerous traditions beyond Christianity. The emerald that fell from Lucifer's crown appears in Islamic mysticism as the green jewel of perfect wisdom. Jewish tradition speaks of the shamir, a supernatural stone that could cut through any material and was used to build Solomon's temple without iron tools. Alchemists wrote of the philosopher's stone that could transmute base metals to gold and grant immortality, describing it in terms remarkably similar to Wolfram's Grail. The stone becomes a universal symbol of divine wisdom materialized, heaven's truth made tangible, if not comprehensible to human understanding. The neutral angels who carried the stone to earth, those who refused to take sides in the war between God and Lucifer, introduce a theological complexity that Orthodox Christianity couldn't easily accommodate. Dante would place such neutral angels in the vestibule of hell, neither saved nor properly damned, but Wolfram grants them a strange dignity as guardians of something beyond the simple binary of good and evil. The Grail stone exists in a space between redemption and fall, offering a different kind of salvation that doesn't require taking sides in cosmic conflict, but demands absolute purity of purpose nonetheless. Wolfram's Parzival must undergo a journey more complex than Percival's, making mistakes that lead to years of wandering in spiritual desolation before achieving the Grail through compassion rather than perfection. When he finally asks the crucial question, "Uncle, what ails you?" it comes not from courtesy or training, but from genuine human sympathy developed through suffering. The stone responds to this earned wisdom differently than it does to Galahad's inherited purity, suggesting multiple paths to the same mystery, each valid according to the seeker's nature and experience. Chapel Perilous. The chapel stands at no crossroads, beside no road at all, emerging from the forest like a tooth from diseased gums. White stone stained with vertical streaks of rust or blood, or something that resembles both but is neither. No path leads to its door, yet every knight who seeks the Grail finds it eventually. Usually when lost beyond hope of recovery, when the forest has become a green maze that seems to rearrange itself with every turn. The chapel's door stands always open, hanging from one hinge, creaking in a wind that touches nothing else, a sound like breathing or like laughter suppressed too long. Inside, darkness has weight and texture, pressing against exposed skin like wet wool, carrying the scent of ceremonies performed in languages that predate human speech. An altar occupies the far end, though the space seems to expand and contract with each step, sometimes vast as a cathedral, sometimes close as a coffin. On the altar lies something covered with a black cloth that moves without wind, rising and falling as if what lies beneath still breathes. Some say it's a knight who failed the Grail test, cursed to lie in eternal dying. Others claim it's the Grail itself in its darkest aspect, showing what sacred vessels become when approached with impure intent. The test varies for each knight, but always involves confronting what they most fear to acknowledge about themselves. Lancelot sees Guinevere and Arthur entwined in love that excludes him entirely, not betrayal, but completion that makes his own passion irrelevant. Gawain faces mirrors that show his violence stripped of glory, just butchery, without honour or purpose. Kay finds silence, the absence of the bitter words that have become his only way of touching the world. Each knight must choose whether to flee, fight, or accept what the chapel reveals, and most choose the first two options, bursting from the door, gasping as if they've been underwater, finding their horses dead or aged decades in the moments they spent inside. Those few who accept what Chapel Perilous reveals report a transformation in the darkness, a slow warming like dawn arriving after endless night. The thing on the altar sits up, throws off its black cloth, reveals itself as a figure of light too bright to perceive features, offering a blessing or a curse, or perhaps understanding that both are the same gift differently received. These knights emerge changed in ways they cannot articulate, carrying knowledge that cannot be shared through words, only recognized in the eyes of others who have undergone the same ordeal. The Cathar treasure. On the night of March 15th, 1244, as the fires burned at the base of Mont Segur, 4 perfect ones descended the sheer cliff face on ropes, carrying something wrapped in wool and leather into the darkness beyond the Crusaders' lines. The siege had lasted 9 months, the last stand of the Cathar heresy against the Albigensian crusade that had already consumed most of Languedoc in blood and flame. 220 Cathars would burn the next morning, singing hymns as the flames took them. But these 4 escaped with what some claimed was the true Grail, the treasure of the pure ones who rejected the material world as Satan's creation. The Cathars believed in 2 gods, the evil Rex Mundi, who created the physical universe, and the good God, who ruled the realm of spirit. Human souls were sparks of divine light, trapped in flesh, and only through perfect knowledge, gnosis, could they escape the cycle of reincarnation and return to the pleroma, the fullness of divine light. They rejected the cross as an instrument of torture, denied that Christ had a physical body, and claimed the Catholic Church served the devil through its accumulation of worldly power and wealth. Their perfect ones, the perfecti, lived in absolute poverty and chastity, eating no meat, telling no lies, refusing all violence, even in self-defense. Montsegur, their mountain fortress in the Pyrenees, had become the centre of Cathar resistance and possibly the repository of their greatest secret. Some researchers have suggested that the Cathars possessed documentation proving their version of Christianity traced directly to Mary Magdalene, who fled to southern France after the crucifixion. Others propose they had the Gospel of John in its original form, before Roman editors corrupted it to support incarnation theology. The Grail, in this interpretation, becomes not a physical cup, but perfect knowledge of spiritual truth, gnosis that reveals the material world's illusory nature. The connection between Cathars and the Grail was reinforced by Wolfram von Eschenbach's claim that the Grail castle was at Montsalvat, which some identify with Montsegur. The timing seems suggestive. Wolfram was writing just as the Albigensian crusade was destroying Cathar culture, possibly encoding in his romance truths that could no longer be spoken openly. The Grail as stone rather than cup fits Cathar theology better than Orthodox Christianity, representing pure spirit materialized rather than divine blood contained in earthly vessel. What the 4 Cathars carried down the mountain remains unknown. The legend says they buried it in a cave system that honeycombs the mountains around Montsegur, protected by symbols and curses that only another perfect one could safely navigate. Nazi expeditions in the 1930s, led by Otto Rahn, searched extensively for this treasure, believing it would grant them mystical power to establish their 1,000-year Reich. They found nothing definitive, only empty caves and local legends that shifted like smoke when grasped too firmly. The Cathar connection adds a layer of heretical danger to the Grail legend, suggesting that what the knights seek might not confirm Orthodox faith but challenge it fundamentally. The wasteland around the Grail castle could represent the world as the Cathars saw it, material creation corrupted by its very nature, awaiting not redemption but escape. The wounded Fisher King becomes humanity itself, trapped in flesh, unable to heal, because healing would mean accepting the body's reality rather than transcending it entirely. Corbenick's shifting walls. The castle exists in a state of perpetual transformation, its walls flowing like water frozen at different moments, creating architecture that follows dream logic rather than physical law. Towers appear and disappear with the viewing angle, Bridges span distances that change with each step. Doorways open onto rooms that shouldn't exist in the same dimensional space. Corbenic, Carbonek, the castle adventurous. It bears many names, because no single name can contain its multiplicity, its refusal to be one thing in one place at one time. Those who reach it report contradictory experiences that somehow all feel true. Some find it rising from marsh waters on foundations of glass or crystal. Transparent walls revealing ceremonies enacted in endless repetition. The same feast always beginning, never consumed. Others discover it carved into a mountainside, its halls extending impossibly deep into rock that grows warm near the centre, as if approaching the earth's heart or hell's antechamber. Still others describe it floating above ground, suspended by no visible means, accessible only by a bridge that materializes for the worthy and dissolves beneath the unworthy's weight. Time within Corbenic follows its own patterns, sometimes racing so that minutes outside become years within, sometimes crawling until a night's stay ages the outside world by decades. Knights emerge from a single feast to find their armour rusted, their horses dead of old age, their squires become grandfathers. Others spend what seems like years in the castle's halls, only to discover the sun hasn't moved in the sky outside. The Grail procession might occur once each evening, or continuously, the same maidens bearing the same objects, through the same hall where the same wounded king lies, waiting for the same question that never comes, or always comes too late, or comes in words that transform meaning with each utterance. You kneel before the vision. Your knees strike stone, with a sound that echoes longer than the hall's dimensions should allow, each reverberation returning changed, carrying harmonics that make your bones resonate like struck bells. The Grail hovers before you at eye level, neither supported nor falling, rotating slowly to reveal aspects that shouldn't exist on a three-dimensional object. It appears as cup and stone, and dish and light simultaneously, your mind unable to force it into a single form, accepting instead this impossibility that makes all other impossibilities seem reasonable by comparison. The light it emits doesn't illuminate, but rather reveals what was always present but hidden. You see your own bones through flesh that has become transparent as water. See your heart beating with a rhythm that matches something vast and distant, perhaps the pulse of creation itself. Your blood moves through vessels that branch like trees, like rivers, like the veins in leaves, following patterns that repeat at every scale, from the microscopic to the cosmic. You understand, with a certainty that bypasses thought, that you are seeing truly for the first time, that everything before was shadows on cave walls. Words rise in your throat, the question you came to ask, but they dissolve before reaching your tongue, revealed as inadequate to the reality before you. Language itself seems suddenly primitive, a child's toy compared to the direct communication happening between your consciousness and whatever consciousness inhabits, or perhaps is the Grail. It knows your question before you ask it, knows every question you might ever ask, and the answer is both simpler and more complex than human understanding can grasp, a truth that can be lived but not spoken. The vision offers itself to you, not the Grail as object but the state of being it represents, a transformation that would burn away everything you consider yourself, leaving only what was always eternal. You feel the possibility of accepting, of letting go of the boundaries that define you as separate from the light, separate from the stone beneath your knees, separate from the hearts of all who have ever knelt here before. But something holds you back, some attachment to the particular configuration of matter and memory you call yourself, and in that hesitation, the vision begins to fade, not rejecting you but accepting your choice with infinite patience. You find yourself on your knees in an empty hall, or perhaps beside a forest stream, or in a ruined chapel, the location uncertain, because what matters is not where but when. This moment of offered transformation that comes to every seeker, usually only once, the moment when the Grail reveals that it was never about finding an object, but about becoming what the object represents. The question never asked. Percival returns to the Fisher King's castle after 5 years of wandering, 5 years of failure and learning, 5 years of discovering that prowess means nothing if compassion is absent. He has defeated every knight who challenged him, rescued every maiden who required rescue, completed every quest but the one that matters. His armor bears the scars of 100 battles, but more importantly, his heart bears the scars of understanding gained through suffering. He has learned from a hermit uncle that the Fisher King is his cousin, that the Grail serves his grandfather, that his own mother died of grief when he left her to pursue knighthood. The weight of these connections, these responsibilities ignored in his youth, has transformed him from a simple seeker of glory into something more complex, a man who understands the cost of his choices. The castle appears exactly where it was before, as if it has been waiting patiently for his return, though he has searched for it desperately through forests that seemed infinite in their hostility. This time he notices details that escaped him before: how the servants move with the mechanical precision of the traumatized, how the Fisher King's wound smells of roses and corruption simultaneously, how the hall itself seems to exhale suffering with each draught that moves the tapestries. He understands now that everyone here is frozen in an eternal moment of pain, waiting for release that only the right question can provide. When the Grail procession begins, Percival watches with different eyes. He sees how the maiden, bearing the Grail, weeps, without seeming to know she weeps, tears running down her face in an endless stream that never depletes. He sees how the bleeding lance drips not blood but time itself, each drop containing moments that should have been lived but were lost to the wound's continuation. He sees how the Grail's light doesn't bring joy, but rather illuminates the precise nature of each person's suffering, making it visible and therefore potentially healable. This time, when the Grail passes, Percival doesn't hesitate. The question rises from compassion rather than curiosity, from love rather than duty. "Uncle," he says, though the Fisher King might not be his uncle, but the word carries the weight of claimed kinship, of refusing the distance that allows suffering to continue unaddressed. Whom does the Grail serve? The words seem simple, but they acknowledge what his younger self couldn't see, that the Grail serves someone, that its purpose isn't merely to exist as a marvel, but to sustain, to heal, to connect. The Fisher King's face transforms, not with healing, but with recognition, as if he has been seen truly for the first time in centuries. "It serves my father," he answers, "who has lived these 12 years on nothing but the host it brings him, who exists in such holiness that he needs no earthly food." And in the speaking, in the acknowledgement of the relationship between Grail and service, between sacred object and human need, the spell breaks. The Fisher King rises from his bed, his wound closing like a mouth that has finally spoken its secret. The wasteland beyond the castle walls begins to green, water flowing in streams that have been dry so long their courses were forgotten. Malory's final testament is less than #0. 5# is greater than night. Sir Thomas Malory wrote Le Morte d'Arthur in prison, possibly Newgate, possibly during the Wars of the Roses, when the world he knew was tearing itself apart in dynastic conflict that made mockery of chivalric ideals. He was himself a knight who had been accused of rape, robbery, and attempted murder, charges that may have been politically motivated, or may reflect the gap between Arthurian romance and the brutal reality of 15th century knighthood. His great work, completed around 1470 and printed by Caxton in 1485, would become the definitive English version of the Arthurian cycle, fixing in language what had been fluid in oral tradition. Malory's Grail quest, which he called the Cinq Grail, occupies books 13 through 17 of his 21-book opus, the spiritual heart of a work otherwise concerned with earthly battles and courtly love. He drew primarily from the French Vulgate cycle, particularly the Quest del Cinq Grail, but transformed his sources through compression and selection, creating a narrative that moves with grim inevitability toward the dissolution of the Round Table. His Grail quest isn't a triumph, but a tragedy, revealing the spiritual inadequacy of even the greatest earthly knights, showing how the pursuit of divine perfection destroys human fellowship. The role of Lancelot in Malory's version becomes particularly poignant. The best knight in the world by all earthly measures, yet forever barred from the Grail by his love for Guinevere. He achieves partial visions, approaching closer than any other imperfect knight, but always falls short at the crucial moment. In one devastating scene, he watches through a doorway as his son Galahad achieves the Grail, unable to enter, unable to turn away, suspended between the divine he cannot reach and the earthly he can no longer fully embrace. His swooning at the threshold becomes an image of human limitation, the boundary between what we can see and what we can attain. Malory emphasises the Grail's British location more strongly than his French sources, making it part of England's sacred geography. The Grail knights don't journey to distant lands, but through a transformed Britain, where every familiar forest might hide miracles or demons, where hermits in humble cells possess more wisdom than kings in castles. This domestication of the marvellous suggests that spiritual quest doesn't require pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but attention to the sacred possibilities in one's own landscape, though few have eyes to see them. The language Malory uses for the Grail scenes shifts from his usual straightforward prose to something more elevated, almost biblical in its cadences. When describing Galahad's final achievement, he writes, "And therewith he kneeled down tofore the table, and made his prayers, and then suddenly his soul departed to Jesu Christ. And a great multitude of angels bare his soul up to heaven, that the two fellows might well behold it." The simplicity barely contains the mystery, suggesting experiences that exceed language's capacity to convey them. Malory's imprisonment adds another layer to his Grail narrative. Writing in captivity, possibly facing execution, he created a vision of spiritual freedom that transcends physical constraint. The Grail quest becomes a metaphor for the soul's liberation from the body's prison, though Malory seems to mourn what is lost in that liberation. The Round Table's destruction, which follows inevitably from the Grail quest, reflects perhaps his own sense of a world ending, the medieval synthesis of Christianity and chivalry giving way to something harder, more pragmatic, less capable of sustaining visions. Valencia's chalice. In the Cathedral of Valencia, behind bulletproof glass, in a chapel where pilgrims kneel on worn marble, sits an agate cup that might be the actual cup of the Last Supper. The Santo Chalice consists of 3 parts: a dark red agate cup, a medieval stem with handles, and a base added later. The cup itself, the upper portion, has been dated by archaeology to between the 4th century BC and the 1st century AD, carved in a workshop somewhere between Egypt and Palestine. Its dimensions and style match the type of ceremonial cup a wealthy Jewish household might have used for Passover celebration. The cup's journey to Spain follows documented history more reliably than most Grail candidates. According to tradition, St. Peter took it to Rome, where it was used by early popes for Mass until the persecution under Emperor Valerian in 258. At that point, Pope Sixtus II entrusted it to his deacon Lawrence, a Spaniard, who sent it to his parents in Huesca for safekeeping. During the Moorish invasion, it was hidden in various Pyrenean monasteries, finally arriving in Valencia in 1437. A gift from King Alfonso the Magnanimous to the cathedral, 2 popes have celebrated Mass with the Santo Chalice, John Paul II in 1982 and Benedict XVI in 2006, lending Vatican recognition, if not official authentication, to its claims. The cup bears no inscription, no miraculous properties beyond survival, no tendency to levitate or glow, or provide unlimited food. It is simply and stubbornly physical, requiring no faith to see, demanding no spiritual purity to approach, though the glass that protects it also separates it from the touch that might confirm or deny its authenticity. The faithful who come to Valencia report no visions, no transformations, only a quiet sense of possibility. If this is the cup, then it held wine that became blood, or became the idea of blood, or became something that transcends the distinction between literal and symbolic. If this is the cup, then it touched the lips of a man who was God, or believed he was God, or was believed by others to be God. The uncertainty doesn't diminish, but rather enhances its power, making each viewer complicit in determining its meaning. The bleeding lance and 4 hallows. The lance that accompanies the Grail in procession drips blood that never coagulates, never darkens, always fresh, as if the wound it made still bleeds somewhere outside time. Medieval romance identified it with the lance of Longinus, the spear that pierced Christ's side. Though Celtic tradition knew older bleeding spears, weapons that thirsted for blood, and would kill their wielders if not regularly fed. The synthesis creates an object that bridges pagan and Christian mysteries, a weapon that caused the wound that produced the blood that fills the Grail, the injury that enables the healing, the violence that makes redemption possible. In the 4 hallows tradition that emerges from Celtic mythology through Arthurian romance into modern occultism, the Grail and lance join the sword and the stone or dish to create a complete symbolic system. These correspond to the 4 suits of the tarot, the 4 elements of medieval cosmology, the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 evangelists with their symbolic animals. The Grail as cup represents water, emotion, the West, the eagle of John. The lance as wand represents fire, will, the South, the lion of Mark. The sword represents air, thought, the East, the man of Matthew. The stone or pentacle represents earth, manifestation. The North, the bull of Luke. The hallows cannot be possessed individually, but must be united to achieve their purpose, which varies depending on the tradition. Sometimes they crown the rightful king, sometimes they heal the wasteland, sometimes they open doorways between worlds. The quest for one inevitably becomes a quest for all, each hallow calling to its companions across whatever distances separate them. Knights who think they seek only the Grail find themselves encountering the other hallows in dreams, visions, or seemingly random discoveries that prove to follow deeper patterns. This 4-fold symbol system appears across cultures in forms that suggest either common origin or psychological universality. The 4 treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann in Irish mythology, the 4 suits of playing cards that reached Europe through Islamic Spain, the 4 tools of ritual magic that appear in grimoires from the medieval period onward. The Grail, as 1/4 of a larger unity, transforms it from unique Christian relic to part of a perennial tradition that predates and transcends any single religion. The bleeding of the lance poses theological problems that medieval writers never fully resolved. Why would the Holy Lance continue to bleed centuries after the crucifixion? Some suggested it bled in sympathy with ongoing human sin, others that it would bleed until the second coming, still others that the blood wasn't Christ's, but that of all the lance had killed in his name during crusades and inquisitions. The blood becomes accusation as much as salvation, reminder of violence done and violence continuing, the price of redemption that somehow never finishes being paid. Wagner's mystic chords. Richard Wagner's Parsifal premiered at Bayreuth in 1882, transforming the Grail legend into what he called a stage consecration festival play, a theatrical ritual that would restore sacred mystery to an increasingly secular age. Wagner had been obsessed with the Grail since his youth, but it took him decades to find the musical language to express what he felt the legend contained. The possibility of redemption through compassion, the transformation of sexual desire into spiritual love, the healing of the wound that modernity had inflicted on the human soul. The opera spans 3 acts that feel like 3 eternities, time stretched and compressed through music that moves at the pace of ritual rather than drama. Wagner's revolutionary harmony, using unresolved dissonances that create constant yearning without satisfaction, mirrors the spiritual hunger that drives the Grail quest. The famous Dresden Amen, that represents the Grail itself, consists of 6 notes that ascend and descend, like breath, like prayer, like the circulation of blood through the body, or grace through creation. When the Grail Knights sing their chorus, the music layers male voices in harmonies that seem to emerge from the earth itself, from stones that remember when they were stars. Wagner's Parsifal is der ein Tor, the pure fool, whose ignorance enables wisdom, whose compassion comes not from understanding, but from shared suffering. In the opera's crucial moment, after killing the swan and witnessing the Good Friday magic, after resisting the flower maidens and experiencing Kundry's kiss, Parsifal suddenly understands Amfortas's wound by feeling it himself, the spear wound opening in his own side through sympathetic identification. The German word, Mitleid, compassion, literally means suffering with, and Wagner makes this literal, showing redemption achieved not through perfection, but through the willingness to share another's pain. The opera house at Bayreuth was designed specifically for Parsifal, with acoustics that make the music seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding the audience in sound that functions as spiritual environment rather than entertainment. Wagner insisted that Parsifal never be performed outside Bayreuth, wanting to preserve its ritual quality, though this restriction was broken after the copyright expired in 1913. He died 6 months after the premiere, making Parsifal his final statement, his attempt to create in art what he felt Christianity had failed to maintain in religion: direct access to the numinous. Wagner's anti-Semitism complicates any approach to Parsifal, particularly his equation of Kundry with the wandering Jew, and his belief that Christianity needed to be purified of Judaic elements. The opera's appropriation by Nazi ideology, its performance at Hitler's birthday celebrations, its use as spiritual justification for racial theories, creates shadows that no amount of beautiful music can entirely dispel. Yet the work itself transcends Wagner's intentions, containing complexities and contradictions that resist simple ideological reduction. Kundry, for all Wagner's prejudices, becomes the opera's most human character, seeking redemption across centuries. Neither wholly good nor evil, but trapped in patterns she cannot break without external grace. Himmler's dark obsession. Heinrich Himmler stood in the castle of Wewelsburg in 1935, envisioning it as the mystical centre of his 1,000-year Reich, a black Camelot for his SS knights, who would forge a new Grail order based on racial purity rather than spiritual virtue. The Reichsführer SS, chicken farmer turned architect of genocide, believed that ancient Aryan mysteries had been preserved in medieval legends, that the Grail was a Nordic symbol appropriated by Christianity, and that recovering it would provide supernatural power to ensure Nazi victory. He transformed Wewelsburg into an SS monastery, complete with a round table for his 12 senior generals, a vault where their death head rings would be preserved, and a northern tower where he planned to house the Grail once his expeditions recovered it. The perversion of Grail symbolism into Nazi ideology represents perhaps the legend's darkest chapter, the transformation of a symbol of divine grace into justification for mass murder. Himmler's Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, sent expeditions across Europe and beyond, searching for evidence of ancient Aryan superiority in archaeology, folklore, and occult traditions. They measured skulls in Tibet, excavated sites in Poland hours before destroying them, and scrutinized medieval texts for coded messages about Germanic destiny. The Grail became part of a delusional mythology that reimagined Jesus as Aryan, King Arthur as Germanic, and the wasteland as the modern world corrupted by Jewish influence that only Nazi purification could restore. The SS rituals at Wewelsburg incorporated elements stolen from Grail romance, Templar tradition, and Teutonic paganism, creating a synthetic religion that replaced Christ with Hitler, salvation with racial hygiene, and compassion with merciless strength. Himmler issued special editions of Wolfram's Parzival to SS officers, with annotations explaining how to read it as an allegory of racial struggle. The pure fool Parsifal became the idealized SS man, innocent of Jewish contamination, while the Grail castle became the Reich that must be defended against subhuman enemies. The wounded king represented the German people, suffering from the stab in the back of Versailles, awaiting the healing that only total war could bring. Otto Rahn, the young scholar whose theories about the Cathar Grail connection attracted Himmler's attention, found himself trapped between his genuine historical research and the ideological demands of his SS patrons. His book Crusade Against the Grail, published in 1933, argued that Montségur was the historical Grail castle and that the Cathars had preserved an ancient Aryan gnosis. Himmler brought him into the SS, funded his expeditions to southern France, and expected him to find physical proof that would validate Nazi mythology. Rahn searched caves around Montségur, interviewed elderly locals who claimed descent from Cathars, and grew increasingly desperate as he found only legends and empty caverns where Himmler expected treasure. The expedition reports from this period read like fever dreams, mixing genuine archaeological observation with fantastic speculation. SS teams reported finding runic inscriptions that proved Germanic presence in the Languedoc, discovered cave paintings they interpreted as ancient Aryan religious symbols, and claimed local traditions about hidden treasure were race memories of the Grail's location. They photographed every carved stone, measured every castle, and interrogated every villager, creating vast archives of useless documentation that testified more to obsession than scholarship. The French locals, with centuries of practice in telling authorities what they wanted to hear while revealing nothing, sent the Nazis chasing shadows across the Pyrenees. Himmler's personal beliefs grew more bizarre as the war progressed and German defeat became inevitable. He convinced himself that the Allies' success came from their possession of the Spear of Destiny, the lance that pierced Christ's side, which Hitler had seized from Vienna but failed to understand properly. He believed the Grail was hidden in Montserrat in Spain, protected by the Black Madonna, who was actually Kundry from Wagner's opera. He sent Otto Skorzeny, the commando who rescued Mussolini, to search for it even as Allied armies closed in on Germany. The Grail quest became a symptom of the regime's descent into apocalyptic madness, the transformation of mythology into psychosis that demanded actual blood sacrifice. The corruption of Grail symbolism by the Nazis created lasting damage to the legend's study, making any discussion of Germanic elements or racial themes in medieval literature politically radioactive. Serious scholars had to distance themselves from subjects that Nazi pseudo-scholarship had contaminated, leaving aspects of the Grail tradition unexplored or discussed only with extensive disclaimers. The legend's capacity to inspire both spiritual seeking and murderous delusion revealed something disturbing about human nature, the ease with which symbols of transcendence can be perverted into justifications for atrocity. Otto Rahn's fatal quest. Otto Rahn climbed through the Austrian Alps in March 1939, leaving his SS uniform folded neatly at the mountain's base, walking into a snowstorm from which he would not return. At 34, the author and Grail researcher had reached the end of a path that began with romantic fascination and ended in moral catastrophe. His frozen body, found days later, carried no identification, no final message, only the silence of someone who chose death over continued participation in an ideology that had twisted everything he once believed. Rahn had come to the Grail through his love of medieval literature, studying philology at university, hiking through the Languedoc as a young man, enchanted by troubadour poetry and Cathar mystery. He worked as a tour guide at Montségur, spending his free time exploring caves where he imagined Templar knights had hidden their treasure. His first book revealed genuine scholarship mixed with imaginative speculation, the work of someone who wanted to believe in mystery more than solve it. He wrote of sitting in caves by candlelight, feeling the presence of long-dead heretics, hearing in the wind through mountain passes the songs of minnesingers who encoded cosmic secrets in courtly love poetry. When Himmler recruited him in 1936, Rahn perhaps believed he could pursue his research with SS funding while remaining intellectually independent. His second book, Lucifer's Court, published in 1937, shows the strain of trying to reconcile his mystical Christianity with Nazi paganism. He wrote of Lucifer as the light bringer, unfairly demonized by Orthodox Christianity, a god of illumination that Cathars and Templars had secretly worshipped. But between the lines, careful readers could detect his growing horror at what his patrons expected him to find and become. He described SS ceremonies at Wewelsburg with subtle irony, praised Germanic virtue in language that bordered on parody. The homosexuality he had hidden throughout his career became increasingly difficult to conceal within the SS, an organization that publicly executed homosexuals while privately harboring many in its ranks. Rahn faced blackmail, threats of exposure, pressure to marry, to provide cover. His Jewish ancestry, discovered through genealogical research, the SS, conducted on all its members, added another layer of danger. He was living multiple lies, wearing a uniform that represented everything he had come to despise, searching for a grail that he no longer believed could be found, or should be found, by those who sought it for power, rather than wisdom. His final journey into the mountains might have been suicide, or might have been escape that failed, an attempt to cross into Switzerland that ended in avalanche or exhaustion. Some researchers suggest he was murdered, that his criticism of the regime had become too obvious, that he knew secrets about SS, occult practices that couldn't be allowed to survive. The mythology that surrounds his death mirrors the ambiguity of the Grail itself, truth forever obscured by legend, historical fact, inseparable from wishful interpretation. The morning mist at Glastonbury. Dawn comes late to Glastonbury in autumn, the sun struggling through mist that rises from the Somerset levels like the breath of sleeping earth. Pilgrims gather at the base of the Tor before first light, their footsteps muffled by dew-heavy grass, their voices reduced to whispers by something in the air that demands reverence, or at least quiet acknowledgement of mystery. They come seeking different things, some the Arthur of history, others the Christ of Apocrypha, still others, the goddess who was worshipped here before either hero arrived. The Tor itself remains indifferent to their seeking, worn smooth by millions of climbing feet yet somehow unchanged, a threshold between worlds that opens for some and remains forever closed to others. The Tower of St. Michael crowns the Tor's summit, all that remains of a church destroyed by earthquake in 1275. Some say the earthquake was divine judgment on monks who had grown too wealthy, others that it was the earth goddess reclaiming her sacred hill from Christian colonization. The tower stands hollow now, framing sky where once it housed bells that called the faithful to prayer. Through its empty doorway, you can see across Somerset to the Bristol Channel, a view that encompasses centuries of human seeking, from the lake villages of prehistory to the music festivals of modernity. Modern pilgrims follow the ancient, labyrinthine path that spirals around the Tor, though archaeologists debate whether this pattern was carved by human intention or natural erosion. The path takes 7 circuits to reach the summit, the number of completion in mystical traditions, the days of creation, the classical planets, the chakras of Eastern meditation that have been awkwardly grafted onto this thoroughly Western landscape. Each circuit supposedly represents a spiritual lesson, though different guides provide different interpretations, and many walkers simply enjoy the gradually expanding view without seeking deeper meaning. At the chalice, well, the red spring flows at a constant temperature and rate, unaffected by drought or flood, as if connected to sources deeper than weather can reach. The iron oxide that colours it has been analysed by geologists, who explain it through mineral deposits and water tables, but explanation doesn't diminish the effect of seeing what looks like blood flowing from the earth, tasting metal on your tongue that recalls something older than memory. Visitors fill plastic bottles with the water, carry it home to places where springs run clear, but somehow less meaningful. Use it to bless gardens, children, new ventures that need whatever blessing iron-tinted water can provide. The abbey ruins draw their own pilgrims, those seeking the grave of Arthur that monks claimed to discover in 1191. The site is marked now by a modern sign that explains the discovery was probably fraudulent, a fundraising scheme for rebuilding after fire. Yet people still leave flowers on the empty grave, as if the possibility of Arthur matters more than archaeological fact. The kitchen abbot's building survives intact, its 4 fireplaces large enough to roast whole oxen, testimony to the wealth that flowed through this place when pilgrims came seeking physical healing and spiritual transformation. When the abbey claimed to possess the earliest Christian church in Britain, built by Joseph of Arimathea himself. You touch the ancient stone. Your palm presses against stone, worn smooth by countless other hands, warm despite the morning chill, as if it retains the heat of every touch it has received across centuries. The texture speaks of geological time, of pressure and transformation that preceded human consciousness. Yet something in the stone seems aware of your presence, responsive to your seeking, even if you cannot articulate what you seek. This might be a piece of the abbey's fallen arch, or a marker from the Druid university that legend claims existed here, or simply a rock that accumulated significance through repetition of human attention. The stone surface reveals complexities that casual observation misses, tiny fossils of creatures that lived when this land was seafloor, crystals that catch light and throw it back, transformed, lichens that might be decades or centuries old, growing so slowly that human perception cannot detect their movement. Your fingers trace patterns that might be natural weathering, or might be carved symbols too worn to interpret, messages from people who understood something about this place that modernity has forgotten or never knew. Through your hand, you feel a pulse that might be your own heartbeat, reflected back, or might be something else. The rhythm of underground water, the vibration of traffic on the A361, the resonance of all the prayers and wishes and desperate hopes that have been directed at this landscape. The sensation travels up your arm, a warmth that isn't quite physical, a tingling that suggests circulation improving, or energy moving, or simply nerves responding to sustained pressure and expectation. Around you, other pilgrims perform their own rituals of touch and silence, each locked in private communion with whatever they believe the place contains or represents. Some pray in languages you recognize, and others you don't. Some sit in lotus position, attempting to align chakras. Some simply stand with closed eyes and open hearts, waiting for revelation that may or may not come. A woman leaves a photograph weighted with a pebble at the stone's base. A man pours water from a small vial onto the ground. A child places a dandelion crown on top of the stone, with careful ceremony that suggests this isn't their first visit. You realize that the stone serves as a focal point for intention, rather than possessing inherent power, that what matters is the human capacity to invest meaning in material objects, to make sacred what we choose to approach with reverence. Yet this rationalization doesn't diminish the experience, perhaps enhances it by adding awareness of your participation in a tradition of meaning-making that stretches back to whenever the first human looked at a stone and saw more than mineral matter. When you finally remove your hand, the absence of contact feels like loss, though what you've lost remains unclear. The stone bears no trace of your touch, offers no acknowledgement of your presence, yet something has been exchanged, some subtle transaction between consciousness and matter that escapes definition but insists on significance. You carry something away with you, not in your hand but in your memory of touching, in the knowledge that you've joined the countless others who have sought something here and found, if not what they sought, at least the confirmation that seeking itself has value. Roslin's encrypted promise. Roslin Chapel crouches in Midlothian, like a stone encyclopedia of esoteric knowledge, every surface carved with symbols that might mean everything or nothing, depending on your capacity for pattern recognition and tolerance for ambiguity. Built in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, the chapel was never completed, ending at what should have been the transept, as if its builder received only partial instructions for a structure whose full design required knowledge he didn't possess or wouldn't reveal. The stone itself seems infected with meaning, unable to remain merely structural but insisting on significance in every carved vine, every grimacing green man, every angel whose expression suggests they know something they're not telling. The apprentice pillar spirals with stone vines that seem to grow from the base, ascending in helical patterns that echo DNA structures the carvers couldn't have known, or the caduceus of Hermes, or the world tree of Norse mythology, or simply the fever dream of a sculptor who worked too long in bad light. Legend says the master mason went to Rome for inspiration, returning to find his apprentice had completed the pillar based on a dream. In jealous rage, the master killed the apprentice with a blow to the head, and now their carved faces stare at each other across the chapel, frozen in eternal confrontation between instruction and inspiration, tradition and innovation, the known and the imagined. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code brought millions of tourists to Roslin, searching for the Holy Grail that his novel suggested was hidden in the chapel's underground vault. They find instead a gift shop selling replica Templar crosses and books about sacred geometry, guided tours that carefully balance historical fact with the myths that bring paying visitors. The guides point out the carved corn and aloe vera that seem to depict New World plants decades before Columbus, the musical notes encoded in the ceiling's cube patterns, the possible Templar symbols that might link the Sinclairs to that disbanded order. They don't mention that ground-penetrating radar has revealed the vault contains nothing but rubble, that the corn might be stylized wheat, that the musical interpretation produces melody only through selective reading. Yet the chapel does contain genuine mysteries that survive debunking. The Sinclairs were indeed connected to Templar families, providing refuge for knights fleeing persecution. The chapel's design incorporates elements from Solomon's Temple as medieval minds imagined it, suggesting builders who saw themselves as inheritors of ancient wisdom. The sheer density of symbolism, with every surface covered in meaningful carving, creates an effect that transcends individual interpretation, a kind of semantic overload that forces the mind to accept mystery rather than solve it. The green men carved throughout the chapel, over 100 faces sprouting vegetation from mouth and nose and eyes, predate Christianity, yet were incorporated into this Christian space without apparent conflict. They suggest the older tradition that Wagner glimpsed, that the Grail romancers encoded, the recognition that sacred truth might wear different masks in different ages while remaining essentially unchanged. The chapel becomes a stone library of this perennial philosophy, readable by those who know the languages it speaks, incomprehensible but still affecting to those who don't. Modern Grail seekers who come to Roslin find not the cup, but the question the cup represents. What happens when divine truth enters historical time, when infinite meaning tries to express itself through finite forms? The chapel provides no answer, but elaborates the question through such complexity that simple answers become impossible. Every carved surface suggests that meaning proliferates rather than resolves, that truth might be less like a theorem to prove than a garden to tend, growing wild despite our best efforts at cultivation. The Nantios Cup's humble truth. In a bank vault in Wales sits a wooden bowl, dark with age and handling, more fragment than vessel now, worn away by centuries of lips, seeking healing from its rim. The Nanteos Cup, named for the mansion where it was kept for 200 years, lacks every quality that should belong to the Holy Grail. It is neither gold, nor silver, nor stone, holds no jewels, emits no light, and provides no miraculous plenty. Yet pilgrims sought it out for generations, travelling to the Powell family estate to drink water from this wooden cup that might have been turned on a lathe in Glastonbury's Abbey, might have been carried to Wales by monks fleeing Henry's dissolution, might be nothing more than a medieval drinking vessel, invested with hope and worn smooth by desperate belief. The cup's documented history begins only in the late 19th century, when the Powell family started allowing visitors to drink from it, though they claimed it had been in their possession since the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. Their story evolved with each telling. Sometimes it came from Glastonbury via Strata Florida Abbey, sometimes directly from Somerset monks, sometimes through marriages that connected Welsh gentry to English religious houses. The cup performed modest miracles, healing small ailments, providing comfort to the dying, never anything dramatic enough to attract official church attention, but sufficient to maintain local faith in its power. By the 1950s, the cup had been reduced to a fragment from pilgrims biting pieces off to carry home, believing that even a splinter contained the full power of the whole. The Powell family moved it to a bank for safekeeping, bringing it out only for special occasions, when someone's need seemed genuine enough to risk further damage. Scientific analysis revealed it to be made of Lai chelm, dated to somewhere between the 13th and 15th centuries, consistent with medieval manufacture, but proving nothing about its ultimate origin or significance. The Nantios cup represents the Grail tradition at its most humble and perhaps most authentic, stripped of romance, and reduced to simple human need, as meeting possible divine presence in a wooden bowl anyone might have owned. It suggests that the Grail might be hiding not in heavily guarded castles or encrypted chapels, but in plain sight, overlooked because it lacks the grandeur an imagination expects. The cup's gradual consumption by those seeking healing becomes its own metaphor, the sacred destroyed by the very devotion it inspires, faith literally eating away at its object until only memory remains. Jungian depths, the Grail within. Carl Jung understood the Grail not as historical artifact, but as psychological reality, a symbol emerging from what he called the collective unconscious, that reservoir of images and patterns shared by all humanity beneath the surface of individual awareness. In his reading, the Grail quest represents individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically complete, integrating the shadow, anima or animus, and other archetypal contents into conscious awareness. The wasteland is the modern psyche, cut off from its depths, requiring not external salvation, but internal reconciliation to restore fertility and flow. The Fisher King becomes the wounded masculine principle, damaged by over-rationalization, by the split between thinking and feeling that characterizes modern consciousness. His wound in the thigh or groin suggests sexual dysfunction, but more broadly represents creative impotence, the inability to generate new life, whether physical or spiritual. The question that heals him, whom does the Grail serve, forces recognition that the ego isn't the psyche's center, that consciousness serves something greater than itself, what Jung termed the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends and includes all partial identities. Each knight who seeks the Grail encounters projections of their own unconscious contents. Lancelot's partial vision reflects his incomplete individuation, his inability to withdraw projections from Guinevere and integrate his anima. Gawain's failures stem from over-identification with the persona, the social mask that prevents authentic self-knowledge. Only Galahad or Percival, depending on the version, achieves the Grail because they've completed the psychological work, achieved what Jung called the transcendent function that unites opposites without destroying their tension. Jung's own visions, recorded in his Red Book, include Grail-like imagery, cups of blood that must be drunk, wounded gods who require human recognition to heal, quests through internal landscapes that mirror external adventures. He painted mandalas that resembled rose windows from Gothic cathedrals, geometric representations of psychic wholeness that suggested the Grail Castle's round table, the circular completeness that has no beginning or end. His tower at Bollingen became his own Grail Castle, a physical structure built to contain and express psychological realities that exceeded rational articulation. The Jungian interpretation transforms the Grail quest from external adventure to internal necessity, from medieval romance to modern therapy. Yet this psychological reading doesn't diminish the mystery but relocates it, suggesting that what medieval knights sought in forest and castle exists in the psyche's depths, accessible through dreams, active imagination, and careful attention to synchronicities that reveal meaning's patterns. The Grail becomes not something to find, but something to become. Not a vessel to possess, but a capacity to develop, the ability to hold opposites in creative tension without splitting into neurosis or collapsing into unconsciousness. This psychological Grail offers hope for modernity's wasteland, suggesting that healing doesn't require recovering medieval faith but developing psychological sophistication, learning to read internal symbols with the same attention once given to external signs. The quest continues, not on horseback through enchanted forests, but in analysis, rooms and meditation cushions, in dream journals and art therapy, wherever individuals undertake the difficult work of becoming whole. The Grail serves the self, Jung would say, and in serving the self, we serve something that transcends individual psychology while working through it. Cinema's silver chalice. Hollywood discovered the Grail in 1975 when Monty Python and the Holy Grail transformed sacred quest into absurdist comedy, knights who say, "Ni," killer rabbits, and coconut shells clapping in place of horses that the budget couldn't afford. The film's genius lay not in mocking the Grail tradition, but in recognizing its inherent absurdity, the gap between noble intention and muddy reality that every sincere seeker eventually confronts. When God appears as an irritated patriarch, complaining about prayers, when the quest ends with a police arrest for disturbing the peace, the film suggests that seeking transcendence in a material world inevitably produces comedy alongside tragedy. Steven Spielberg's Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade in 1989 made the Grail an artifact of power contested between Nazis and Americans. Protected by an immortal crusader knight who had been waiting 700 years for someone to choose correctly among dozens of false grails. "You have chosen wisely," he tells Indiana, when the archaeologist selects not the golden chalice fit for a king, but the simple cup of a carpenter. The film's Grail grants healing and immortality, but only within the temple's boundaries, suggesting that some truths can't be possessed, only experienced in their proper context. John Borman's Excalibur, in 1981, presented the Grail as pure light captured in a cup, achieved through Percival's recognition that Arthur and the land are one, that the king's wound reflects the kingdom's suffering. The film's operatic excess, its armour that never stops gleaming, its forest that pulses with green life or withers to grey death depending on spiritual conditions, captures something essential about the Grail tradition's emotional intensity, its refusal to remain within realistic bounds. Terry Gilliam's The Fisher King, in 1991, relocated the Grail to modern Manhattan, where a homeless man, traumatized by violence, believes the cup sits in a billionaire's mansion, a trophy unrecognized by its owner. The film suggests that Grail quests continue wherever wounded humans seek healing, that Fisher Kings lie on every street corner, that the question, "Whom does the Grail serve?" applies to contemporary capitalism as much as medieval feudalism. Robin Williams's character achieves his Grail not through conquest, but through human connection, through being seen and loved despite his madness. Each cinematic grail reflects its era's anxieties and aspirations. The Python Grail mocks authority in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate. Spielberg's Grail offers clear moral choices in a decade of renewed Cold War tensions. Boorman's Grail promises ecological redemption as environmental awareness grew. Gilliam's Grail provides healing for urban alienation and random violence. The films collectively suggest that the Grail legend survives because it adapts, absorbing contemporary concerns while maintaining its essential structure of quest, failure, and occasional transformation. The Garden at Twilight. Evening settles over the garden like a benediction, purple shadows pooling beneath roses that release their final fragrance of the day, a sweetness that speaks of endings that are also completions. The paths between the flower beds curve in patterns that please the eye without revealing their logic, leading visitors through beauty that doesn't insist on meaning beyond its own existence. A fountain murmurs at the garden's heart, water falling and rising in cycles that began before you arrived and will continue after you leave. 2 says, the sound both constant and constantly changing. Birds perform their twilight chorus, not the exuberant songs of morning, but quieter communications, settling disputes over roosting places, calling mates to safety, marking the transition from day's bright clarity to night's soft mystery. The air itself seems to thicken with approaching darkness, becoming something you move through rather than simply exist within, carrying the day's warmth like memory, even as coolness rises from the earth. Flowers that blazed with colour an hour ago now fade to suggestions of themselves, their forms more important than their hues in this gentle dissolution of distinctions. A stone bench offers rest at the garden's edge, worn smooth by seasons of sitting, carved with words too weathered to read, though your fingers can trace letters that might spell remember or return, or simply decorative patterns that meaning-seeking minds transform into message. The stone holds the day's heat in its mass, warming your back as you sit, watching darkness paint the garden in shades of shadow and suggestion, everything familiar, becoming mysterious as sight yields to other senses. What the Grail means now. In an age that has split the atom and mapped the genome, sequenced consciousness into neurochemical cascades, and reduced mystery to data points, the Grail persists as a symbol of what remains irreducible, the experience that survives explanation. Modern seekers might not ride horses through enchanted forests, but they swallow ayahuasca in Peruvian ceremonies, sit meditation retreats in Buddhist monasteries, pursue peak experiences through extreme sports or extreme fasting, seeking the same transformation that medieval knights pursued through different means. The Grail has become democratized, available to anyone willing to undergo the necessary ordeal, though the ordeal now might be psychological rather than physical, requiring courage to face internal dragons rather than external ones. The question, whom does the Grail serve, resonates differently in an era of ecological crisis and systemic inequality. Perhaps the Grail serves the earth itself, and achieving it means recognizing our wound is the damage we've inflicted on the environment that sustains us. Perhaps it serves the collective human future, and the quest requires abandoning competitive individualism for cooperative survival. Perhaps it serves consciousness itself, that mystery of awareness that emerges from matter but transcends it, the light that recognizes itself in every seeking soul. New Age bookshops sell crystal grails and meditation bowls, essential oils blessed in Glastonbury, guided visualizations that promise to lead seekers to their personal Grail castle. The commercialization seems to mock the tradition, yet it also testifies to persistent hunger for transcendence that consumer culture cannot satisfy. People who would never call themselves religious undertake spirit quests, vision quests, healing journeys that follow the Grail pattern even when they don't recognize it. The wasteland of modern alienation calls for the same healing the Fisher King required, though now the wound might be called depression, anxiety, existential emptiness, rather than divine punishment. The Grail appears in unexpected places, in the cup of water offered to marathon runners, in the communion chalice, raised in churches that barely remember what they're commemorating, in the tea ceremony that transforms ordinary drinking into spiritual practice. Scientists searching for unified field theory, artists pursuing perfect expression, lovers seeking complete union, all participate in quests that echo the Grail pattern, seeking something that always exceeds grasp, finding meaning in the search itself rather than its completion. Technology has become our magic, promising the same transformations that the Grail offered: immortality through uploading consciousness, unlimited abundance through molecular manipulation, healing through genetic engineering. Yet each achievement reveals new lacks. Each answer generates new questions. Each healing exposes deeper wounds. The Grail recedes as we advance, maintaining the same sacred distance, requiring the same surrender of ego, the same recognition that what we seek we already possess but cannot see until we stop seeking it. The cup that cannot be held. The Grail's final mystery is that it cannot be possessed, only experienced, cannot be held, only allowed to pass through our lives like light through stained glass, transforming us in its passage while remaining itself untransformed. Every attempt to grasp it, to define it, to locate it in specific time and place, causes it to dissolve, leaving only memory of presence and renewed hunger for return. It exists in the space between seeking and finding, in the moment when the question forms, but before the answer crystallizes, in the wound that teaches compassion and the healing that comes through acceptance rather than cure. Perhaps there never was a physical cup, or perhaps there were thousands, every vessel that ever held wine transformed by prayer into blood, every bowl that carried water to parched lips, every grail that reminded drinkers of their thirst for something beyond physical sustenance. The multiplication of grails, each chapel and museum claiming their own, suggests not fraud, but recognition that sacred presence can inhabit multiple forms simultaneously, that truth doesn't follow the logic of material objects that can be in only one place at one time. The knights who failed to achieve the Grail might have succeeded in ways the romances couldn't recognize. Their wandering through wastelands, their its own achievement, their maintenance of hope, despite repeated failure, the real miracle. Lancelot's partial vision might be more human and therefore more valuable than Galahad's complete achievement. The Fisher King's wound that wouldn't heal might be the honest condition, the Grail's healing, a beautiful dream that sustains us through suffering that has no cure, only endurance transformed into meaning through the stories we tell about it. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you carry your own Grail, not a cup but a capacity, not an object but an orientation, not a possession but a practice of remaining open to mystery in a world that insists on solutions. Perhaps the quest continues in your dreams, where symbols speak directly to the unconscious, where transformation happens below the threshold of awareness, where you might find yourself in a castle that exists nowhere and everywhere, approaching a light that reveals everything while explaining nothing. The Grail waits in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence between words, in the darkness between stars, always present, always absent, always offering itself to those who have eyes to see, hearts to feel, souls to receive what cannot be grasped. It serves something greater than individual desire, greater than collective need, greater than cosmic purpose, something that has no name because naming would diminish it, no form because form would limit it, no location because it exists, wherever someone remembers to ask the essential question that heals, by acknowledging what was always whole beneath the appearance of wounding. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. May ancient peace settle over you like a gentle blanket. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.